Hello, this is Mark Friedman. I'm here with my co-host Chris Gray on our new talk show, The Captain's Table. Back in the 1800s, when ships would sail on a long cruise, the captain would invite the passengers he considered to be the most interesting to sit at his table, which was elevated in the dining hall, and he would talk to them while the other passengers listened to the conversation. It was one of the first talk shows, actually. We are trying to bring that tradition back with our podcast radio show, where we will have some great conversations and interesting guests. And I actually couldn't think of a better person to kick off our podcast than Irv Reifman, whose name is not well known, but has been tremendously influential in California politics for decades. He's very humble, so he might try to argue with me about how influential he really was. He also has helped many younger politicians. Irv, welcome to the Captain's Table.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Hey, Irv, can you tell us how you got started in politics here in California?
Yeah, so I don't know what the age bracket of your listeners will be, but in 1946, I was 7 years old, and I knew quite a bit about politics. My parents were pretty sensitive to it, and our neighbor was running for state assembly in the Republican primary, one of the last times I backed a Republican, and his son and I played together, and in those days, candidates had the 3x7 handouts on very expensive paper with pictures and text on both sides, and so the two 7-year-olds were allowed to go to the end of our block and around the corner, and we knocked on doors and, gave out his leaflets. And 2 days later, I was very disappointed to find that he had finished second in the Republican primary. He was a good-looking guy. He'd been a naval officer, a young lawyer, came back from the war, and he wasn't the candidate of the established party. And by 1948, historians will note that Governor Dewey of New York was a heavy favorite to beat President Truman. And I followed that election pretty closely as a kid. I was always interested in politics. And so being in Southern California, I was really aware of who Richard Nixon was. He was a senator, from 1950. And Eisenhower picked him on the ticket as a concession to the more conservative Republicans who were afraid that Eisenhower was going to be too liberal. And he was a bad guy. People knew it then. His campaign manager was Jewish, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism in his campaign, comparing Jews to communists, and everybody was a communist. Anyway, Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic candidate who lost in 52 and 56. So by 1959, I was a pretty sophisticated college student. I felt there was a strong movement, certainly on the UCLA campus, that Stevenson should be the candidate again. And with several friends, we formed Students for Kennedy. And so the first thing I learned about an election is if you're going to have an election, try to make sure you're going to win it. So I packed the audience with 4 or 5 friends, and I was elected president. So there were 2 guys that I had met 65 years ago named Henry Waxman and Howard Berman, and they were leaders of the established Democratic Club on campus, and they were supporting Stevenson, and they tried to get us kicked off campus. That they were the only Democratic club allowed, but I did have to remind them over the years who won that election. And with my involvement with the Kennedy campaign, I was on the floor of the convention in 1960. I was a volunteer. They discovered my skills, so I was a celebrity driver lots of times. And, I stood next to Lyndon Johnson, who was a big man. I was taking a document to Bobby Kennedy's room in the Biltmore Hotel, and the lobby was packed. The elevators were packed, so a busboy showed me the back stairway, and as I went up, there were Bobby and Ethel Kennedy. I think they had 7 kids. where the kids were crying, and they're all sitting in the stairway, and I felt bad about encountering them. And then after the election, we had a common Democratic headquarters, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. And Ted Kennedy visited 3 or 4 times, and he was a sphinx. I mean, anyone who knew him in his career, he was an eloquent spokesman and very natural, but he had just finished law school, and he was very private. His 2 friends who were with him just told me, yeah, he doesn't like to talk to people. But anyway, as a result of that, I became much more interested. Now, historians say that it's important to study history because it will repeat itself. And the history of what was happening in California's Democratic Party is being repeated again. We had the established party, that it was in a minority in both houses of the legislature. California had 1 state senator, and there was a organization called the California Democratic Council that was formed by people in the entertainment industry and liberals, and their main issues were recognition of Red China, which in 1955 was very controversial, abolition of nuclear weapons, abolition of the death penalty, and the more moderate Democrat, and the leaders of that were primarily Alan Cranston, who would ultimately become a U.S. Senator, and Jess Unruh, who had become the Speaker in 1958, or a legislator in 58, and was really the Kennedy spokesman in California, were adamant that let's elect Democrats. They may not agree with us on every issue, but if we don't elect Democrats, we're not going to get anywhere. And Unruh was from Texas. He was a big, burly guy. If you made a movie about him, Orson Welles would have played the part. But he was very dedicated to civil rights. He was very connected in the black community, primarily also in the Hispanic community, but very genuine in his support for civil rights. And so the reason I say history repeats itself is that today there are rumors of some of the Democratic younger members of the House who have encouraged progressives to run against incumbent Democrats. And, what that can do is elect the Republicans, so to speak. So there's been unrest. There was talk 2 years ago that AOC was going to run against Senator Schumer. But anyway, what was interesting about that time, I don't know if anyone knows who their county committee members are or who the young Democrat officers are, but in that period, the Unruh faction and the CDC faction were spending a lot of money on mailers to elect their slates for county committee and young Democrats. And one day I got a call to come to a meeting and said, "Oh, Irv, by the way, you're president of the Hollywood Young Democrats." A group had formed a Democratic club because it would have delegates at the state convention, and I didn't know anything about it except suddenly I was the president. I was lucky to stay out of those battles. So Waxman and Berman were both ended up presidents of the California Young Democrats, and ultimately, as they held office, they got along with Unruh, but always somewhat guarded. So I met Henry and Howard. It sounds astonishing. I've known them for 65 years.
Wow.
And I knew their parents. I know their kids. And the Waxman-Berman machine, as it was called, was very famous in California, and really the candidates they supported in Democratic primaries in in the 70s and 80s almost always won. And they both went on to exceptionally distinguished careers in Congress. They were both in the state assembly before. So we had a position in California called inheritance tax referees, and it's the only position that's a patronage appointment, and they were by the state controller, and referees are the official appraisers for the courts in probate and guardianship and other matters. And in 1974, Ken Correa, an assemblyman from Orange County, was elected controller, and came time to appoint referees, and there were about 150 in the state, and about a fourth of them came up for appointment every year. And so as he looked down the list, he saw it was a bunch of Republican white men, and he solicited friends and colleagues to recommend people, and I had a background in business, and I think Henry and Howard recommended me. I had gotten the highest grade in income tax in law school. So and you had to take an exam, and I became a referee, and like a lot of other groups, 2 years later, at a convention, they had to elect board members, and there was a standoff and a lot of bitter disputes, and somebody recommended me as a compromise candidate, and I got on this board, which was very intimidating for me. And I was on the board again a second year, and I was told I would be the state president. So I had been a referee for 2 years, and I'm the state president, which didn't mean anything except the inheritance tax, which was supposed to be very nominal, and it had an exemption of $500,000 on a single-family home, which was a mistake. There was never a tax on homes, and somebody at the state legislature thought that would be a good idea. And housing prices had doubled or tripled, and widows are calling their legislators saying, hey, I have to pay inheritance tax. And a assemblyman from Bakersfield named Don Rogers, who knew nothing about anything, frankly, got an initiative on the ballot. It was pretty clear it would pass, and it abolished the entire section in the Revenue Taxation Code on the inheritance tax, but also the procedures for the appraisers. And the judges and the state bar loved the independent appraisal system. Every judges would go to conferences around the country, and they'd come back and say, God, all they talked about is probate litigation about appraisal, and we don't have that. We have independent appraisal. So I was designated to say, what can we do to save us? And it was clear the initiative would pass. So I took all the sections that were being abolished and rewrote them, and went to Howard Berman, and a couple of, he was the majority leader in the assembly, and two other prominent assemblymen, and they sponsored a bill. And it was, as I say, it was supported by the state bar, all the legal groups, the judges, but because the controller was a Democrat, the Republicans opposed it, and I was in Sacramento probably 3 days a week for months. Got to know a lot of the legislators. This was before term limits, when legislators, roomed together, were good friends, and we got that bill passed on the last day of the session by 1 or 2 votes in each house, and I could probably do an hour about all the machinations that went into that. At the same time, I've been involved in horse racing my whole life, and I became general counsel for the harness racing industry, but I would be in Sacramento representing horse racing interests in general. So I knew a lot of the legislators on a first-name basis, and it came in handy. In the meantime, I had closer relationships with Henry Waxman and Howard Berman, and pushover. He's quite a cynic. And at the end of one of his shows last year, he announced the Baldy Award, and he started to recite the accomplishments of a particular congressman, and I realized it was Henry Waxman. And then he had a sculpture of Henry's face on like the front of what was a bowling ball. But some university will have someone do a PhD project on Henry. Henry accomplished more in Congress, I think, than any other single congressman on everything to do with health care. People remember the tobacco hearings where he put the CEOs of the tobacco companies under oath, and he was instrumental in trying to get government involved in AIDS litigation, and he was responsible for the Ryan-White Act, which even Ronald Reagan supported at the end. And clean air, clean water. Henry favored some regulation and labeling of vitamins, and there was a whole underground industry of holistic people that produced their own vitamins, and they were opposed to that. I mean, typically those were the kind of people that would support Henry Waxman, but they were picketing and threatening, and he was very statesmanlike and ended up with, appropriate government legislation on that. So,
thank you for sharing that, and it's really an interesting story. And Congressman Waxman changed California so much through the legislation that you referenced, but also the way they remade the way politics are done in California and how people get elected. And I know you were right there every step of the way with them on that. Could you kind of give us some of your perspective on how politics today in California are different because of your work with Berman, Waxman, and D'Agostino?
Yeah, and before I cover that, I would say that with the election of Pat Brown in '58, again, California led the way for the country on civil rights, citizens' rights, health, legislation. The Unruh Civil Rights Act was copied in many states, and again, I don't think California and Pat Brown have been given credit for those accomplishments. And Howard Berman and I spent a day with Pat Brown when he was governor, and somehow he took a liking to me and invited me to his home for lunch, and he never got the credit he deserved. And he was nothing like his son. And we won't discuss Jerry today.
No moonbeam there, right?
But he was in the middle. He wanted to do what the Kennedys wanted, but he was close to the CDC, and he tried to be in the middle. And sometimes when you're in the middle, you get picked on a lot. So I think Henry's story is well known. He challenged an incumbent Democrat in the state assembly. There were a variety of factors favoring him. His uncle published a newspaper that was widely distributed through the Jewish community, and although his uncle had died and his aunt was running the paper, and although I think she voted for Henry, but the paper endorsed the incumbent Mr. McMillan, but Henry won pretty easily. And the secret was, so Michael Berman is about, I think, 4 years younger than Howard, 5 years younger. He had started college but dropped out. We'll talk about Carl D'Agostino, his partner, in a minute. Carl did not graduate high school, but he did get a PhD from MIT. So, unusual people. So Michael comes up with this idea that we're not going to do a mailing to everybody in the district. We're going to target mail. And Michael Berman invented target mailing. And he, with a group of volunteers from the UCLA Westwood Democratic Club, would go down to the registrar of voters, and they would pull out each card, and anyone with a Jewish-sounding name would get a letter, probably an endorsement by some rabbi or about Henry supporting Israel, and that was considered to be, the secret ingredient that Henry got elected. And Henry soon realized that he's in a very safe district, not only in terms of the electorate, but he couldn't really offend his district. I mean, they were pro-Israel, they were very focused on civil rights, and so he started to raise money, and he would distribute it to other people in the Democratic caucus. And so he could call in votes later on, as Howard did. Howard came to the assembly, did the same thing, and then when they were in Congress, they would help candidates, and so their use of fundraising was unique. Candidates had not done that before.
I mean, what you're describing is politics 101 today. The targeting every single campaign on the left and the right, and the raising money to give to other candidates to develop allies and support. Everybody does that. Like my friends in the legislature, they know when they get there, when they're in a safe seat, you're going to have to raise money all the time anyways because we need it for the party or the caucus.
Right, and so what's so interesting is, as Michael continued, they started to use slate cards, which, in primaries and in general elections, Jess Unruh had invented the sample ballot. In the 60 election, we had paper ballots, and you would get in the mail a larger envelope, like 8 by 10, with a sample ballot looking exactly like the ballot you'd get on election day, except it had the boxes filled in. And that was very successful. And then Michael Berman, and then with his partner Carl D'Agostino, started to do slate cards. And by that time, by the 70s, they could have 8 or 10 variations for one assembly district. With computers, they were able to identify people certainly by Jewish people, Hispanic names, which were presumed to be Democratic, labor union membership, and I think I remember one election where there were 12 versions of slate cards, and I was not that involved on a day-to-day basis, so I'm sure there were others. What's interesting about that is today, with so much early voting, I'm not sure if the impact of the slate card is the same as it was back then. Michael Berman didn't believe in polling, but what he would do around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, he would drive to various polling places and look through the trash. And if his slate card showed up more than any other in the trash, he had a pretty good idea that his candidates would win. So I'm not sure on the time restraints, but there was, by 1978, probably, the expression of Waxman-Berman machine became very common, and people from around the country would ask me, so what does that mean? How does your machine work? And I said, well, it doesn't work like it does anywhere else. You don't get jobs as notaries or city clerks or county clerks or sanitation contracts. What it was some enlightened elected officials trying to elect like-minded candidates. And so we had many districts where the population was primarily Hispanic or African American, with older white incumbents, and started to sponsor people who were from those districts.
I just wanted to jump in on the slate cards, being a former political consultant myself, letting you know that the slate cards over the years did evolve, and a different version of from what you mentioned was my parents used to run a polling place, and they would bring home all of the slate cards that people actually took with them to the polls, and we would count and seeing which ones were most effective by basically what they were able to bring home, and we would put our candidates on the cards that people were actually using to make their selections. So it evolved even more for later years.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, and so this machine was really, the issues were, will they support Israel, which was very important to Howard and Henry. You may know that in the AIPAC, which is a pro-Israel political organization, each year takes legislators to Israel on trips, and I would meet African American and Hispanic legislators would say, "Oh, Irv, are you Jewish?" And I was just in Israel. I mean, very clever campaigning. Of course, today Israel is shooting itself in the foot a little bit, but not only like-minded legislators, but while Jerry Brown was governor, and then again when Gray Davis was governor, an unusual amount of women being appointed judges, again, judges from minority groups. One of the key members of the Waxman-Berman machine was Senator Hersch Rosenthal, who I met. We used to sit near each other in the grandstand at Hollywood Park Racetrack when there'd be 40,000 people there on a Saturday. Now it's torn down. We didn't know each other, just to say hello, and he was very active with his wife. They were inseparable. And the Baldwin Hills Democratic Club, which had started with a majority of Jewish members, ended up with many African American members, and they were the key sponsor of Tom Bradley for mayor of Los Angeles. And so that was typical. And as I say, we had, particularly in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area, a lot of women judges appointed, and from different minorities, and with great success. I mean, I'm not going to say anything publicly, but maybe of all the candidates and all the judges they supported and people for some other commissions, one or two turned out to be not so good. But none of their people they supported ever had scandals or bad issues. Let's put it that way.
Let's get into that a little bit, Irv, if I can interrupt. The thing to me that distinguishes your work and your colleagues is a lot of people think of politics as a game, and that it's, just manipulating power and influence. But what you're describing is not values-free. You had a very strong set of values, and you were looking at the most pragmatic and effective way to bring those values into the political arena for the purpose of accomplishing justice and support for the environment, for women, for people of color, and for preserving the state of Israel. So That's a little bit different than the way a lot of people practice politics today, isn't it?
Yes, and even back then, and you have said with great eloquence, I think, what I've been meaning to say, and um, you know, there were many, many opportunities for Henry and Howard to make big money, and we've got to get to Carl D'Agostino and bad campaigns in a minute, but so Carl and Michael, between them, smoked, I don't know, somewhere between 6 and 8 packs of cigarettes a day. And they had won every statewide. First of all, they did the reapportionments for, I think, 70, 80, and 90. And the congressional, I think, for 2000. Plus, they had won statewide initiatives, and the tobacco industry came to them and said, look, you guys are geniuses. Just tell us what you want. We'll hire you. And even though they were heavy smokers, they turned them down. And I would get calls from lawyers in the community saying, oh, I understand you know Henry Waxman or Howard Berman. Our client wants to come see them. And I'd ask what it's about, and, oh, we want to put a gambling casino in Beverly Hills, or, you know, if I thought it was outlandish or inappropriate, I just even wouldn't pass on the call. There were some very legitimate issues that, and Howard and Henry were very responsible. They never asked for any financial support. You know, they were very intelligent, very responsive, and you know, their records show it. So anyway, so I mentioned Carl D'Agostino did graduate from MIT, and he had met Ken Corey at an Orange County Democratic Club. They were probably the only two people there. And anyway, he leaves. He was a major executive, I think, in North American on a rocket ship project, and he became chief deputy controller. But he and Michael were like brothers, and Carl had 5 kids. Michael didn't have any, and I was sitting with them one day, and so you probably, and your listeners are familiar with, when there's an initiative or a campaign, government employees will go on a leave of absence and then work on the political campaign. And then when it's over, they go back to their government job. So that's what Michael had been Henry Waxman's chief of staff, not his brothers. And Carl and he were on leave for some initiative, and we're sitting together at lunch, and they said, you know, if we did this full time, we could make a lot of money. And I said, well, you could. And Carl said, no, because, you know, I've got all these kids, and we need a health plan, and our lives are totally different. And I explained to them that they could each set up their own corporation, and then the 2 corporations could form a 3rd company, which was called Berman D'Agostino Campaigns. And then Michael's assistant, who had been Henry Waxman's, I think, field deputy, Keiko Shimabukura, she was a partner also. So there were ultimately 3 corporations. And so I was there at the beginning, and then about 15 years later, they donated their archives to the University of California, and I was the appraiser to appraise them. So I kind of figure I was there at the birth and the graduation, both. And so during that period, there were really 2 Waxman-Berman machines. There were Henry and Howard at the legislative and government level, and identifying candidates that they felt were appropriate. I remember Howard bringing a young, nervous congressional candidate from Nevada named Harry Reid, and he seemed to succeed in Washington. And but the other Waxman Berman machine was Michael and Carl, and candidates strove to get on their slate, and of course it was a profit making endeavor for them, and they did very well with it. And then after the 1993 elections, or 94, they kind of semi-retired. They continued to work on, obviously, Henry and Howard's elections, and some of the people who were Waxman Berman candidates, Henry's former chief of staff, Burr Margolin, and later Hersch Rosenthal, Terry Friedman, Barbara Friedman. So, and of course, Congressman Mel Levine was an integral part of the original machine, so to speak. But one of my favorite stories is that the slate cards were all over the state, and they included, mosquito abatement districts and water replenishment boards, and they had local legislators or, political activists recommending who to support for these positions. So right before they were going to go to press, they realized they didn't have a candidate, and I think it was like a Fullerton mosquito abatement district. It was some small district in Orange County, and the guy said, well, support, and I don't remember the gentleman's name. He's Jewish, so put his name on the card, and they did. That guy was an incumbent, and he lost. So he sued Berman and D'Agostino for libel, saying they put me on the card because voters would recognize it was a Democratic slate, and even though I was a prominent Republican, they'd vote against me. And of course, we got that case thrown out of court, at the first hearing, first speech. But it was an interesting theory.
Irv, let me just interrupt. I think you've been really humble and not. You've talked about all the accomplishments of all of these important people, but you haven't told them who their lawyer was and what role you played in a lot of that. And I do think the listeners should hear that.
Well, let me say this. They probably had 15 different lawyers. They had lawyers for election law, and Professor Dan Lowenstein was a very close associate. His son worked for bad campaigns. A very prominent criminal lawyer, Harlan Braun, would do recommendations for judges on the slate cards. And, I could name all of them. But it's been fun for me. I never took a paying client, to lobby. And, of course, for the racing industry, I lobbied. And for the probate referees, people were always out to get us. When Machen was governor, he had the Bar Revision Commission undertake a project to abolish us, and we beat that. We were again in the legislature when Kathleen Connell was the controller. She actually wanted to abolish us. John Burton was also, both Phil Burton and John were very close to Waxman and Berman, but John Burton had been a congressman, then he was out of office, and he became a state senator. In between, he was a probate referee. So when Ms. Connell's bill came to the Senate, John Burton, Don Parada, and Bill Lockyer, who were all very closely involved, were on the committee, and it didn't get one vote in the Senate to go forward. But they did have a lot of lawyers, but Bad had had an office on Mid-City on La Cienega Boulevard, and it was about 2 in the morning. And Carl's wife, Evelyn, who passed away a few years ago, was just a wonderful woman. She said, "Oh, hi, Irv, are you calling Carl or Michael?" I said, "No, I'm calling Carl." And she said, "Well, there's 2 calls ahead of you." And I thought, well, what insanity. But I loved about once a week, I would just walk into that office at midnight on my way home from work, and the stories, the incidents were, very colorful. You could do a Damon Runyon novel about them. And the LA Times went after Michael quite a bit. They would call him the devil and vicious, and this is how vicious Michael was. If somebody who worked with them called in, "Oh, I can't come in today, my wife is in the hospital, my mother is," Michael would usually respond by, "He's going to kill me for doing this," sending over a $5,000 check and say, "Well, hang on to this, use it, don't worry about when you pay me." And everybody who was close to him knew he just had unlimited generosity and appreciation for people. So I should mention, the machine has retired, so to speak, but there's 2 famous people around today. Rich Lieb was a young lawyer, a very likable young man. Everybody loved him, and he worked for everybody. He worked for Henry and Howard and Mel Levine. Today, he is the chairman of the Board of Regents of the University of California, which is a very high position in this state. Some of the most famous billionaires have had that position. Another alumni was Keith Weaver, who is a senior vice president for Sony, in charge. He's one of 2 or 3 of their main lobbyists, and he and his wife had gone back to her family's ancestral home in Tennessee and discovered that a ancestor in her family had been an advisor to Jim Beam on how to make bourbon, and they set up their own company, and today she's been honored as I think she's the leading African-American woman owner of a liquor company. But Keith was, again, a very popular and still is young man. But and there was a woman who just passed away named Marilyn Padilla, who was a bookkeeper and learned campaign reporting, and she did the campaign reports for many of the candidates down here. She was born in the East LA ghetto area of Boyle Heights, and worked her way up, and very loved and respected. So, as I say, there's plenty of people who went through Sacramento with ugly stories, and I knew a lot of them. And but the people that worked with them and went through their college and graduated, outstanding records of success, and it's been something special for me to know so many of them.
Well, isn't that how it goes when you're really successful, is when enemies come that have nothing to do with what you've done? We see it today all the time, the efforts to try and impeach Joe Biden before he even took office. And, he was the winner. Pretty resoundingly, he was the winner, right? And in the Waxman, Berman, D'Agostino team, they won so many more times than they lost. And certainly in those days, the LA Times editorial board was extremely conservative, as were most newspapers in the country. So it's kind of a commentary on their success, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And can get a cynic like Bill Maher to praise you unequivocally, that's pretty good. And Howard is an expert on so many different things. He's been out of office for a while, but he's with the leading law firm Covington and Burling, and he is looked upon in the Mideast as a consultant, not so much for Israel, but for the Emirate countries. They know him and trust him, and that's a remarkable testament.
Irv, this is Chris, and I want you mentioning all the women that have been so effective. One we haven't mentioned is your wife, Myra, and I understand she was an Emmy Award-winning newscaster, and before that worked for Assemblyman Berman.
Well, after. So she was the first woman newscaster on television in Sacramento and her hometown of Minneapolis. And then she went to San Francisco, and she was the only live reporter at, with live camera at the Rolling Stones Altamont concert where the Hells Angels killed it. And she had the videotapes, and there were threats on her life. And she won quite a few awards there. And she came down here and was on the NBC station here. And I met her a little later, but she spent a day with Ronald Reagan. She interviewed Arnold Schwarzenegger when he first came to California, and she spent about 3 hours with him. And she came back to the studio and said, "This guy's crazy. He said he came to Los Angeles and that the bodybuilding is just a front. He wants to be a movie star." Everybody laughed, and she said, and then he said, and then after he's a movie star, he wants to get into politics. And everybody laughed even harder. But,
wow,
yeah,
talk about a man with a plan.
Yeah, she died 2 years ago, and one of the most touching things for her, we were at a fundraiser for Amy Klobuchar, and it was a Hollywood crowd. It was at the home of a very senior motion picture executive, and she waited till the crowd thinned down, and she starts to walk up to the senator, and the senator says, "My God, you're Myra Scott. I used to come home from high school every day and watch you on the news." And that was so touching for her. But we were at a dinner. We were seated next to Vice President Mondale. They knew each other personally from Minnesota, and she had graduated from the Fletcher. She got her master's, and she got an internship at the Voice of America with Edward R. Murrow, who also smoked 3 packs.
Yeah.
So we got married, and I met her at a party, and I had 2 older kids, and we had kids right away, but when our son, and then she was anchoring at we had 7 TV stations, but she anchored at one of them, and she did a half-hour interview with Henry Waxman one night. She got to do her own things. The news was very, very different then, but my favorite interview was the Olympic champion Jesse Owens. When she told me she was interviewing him, I raced over and met him in person. But she independently knew a lot of elected officials, and people would gravitate to her. So what our kids would say is, if we were at a political event, we were always the last 2 people to leave, and that was probably true.
You were doing what you loved, right?
Yeah, and so our daughter, who's a young lawyer today with 3 little girls, was graduating high school, and she asked me if she could volunteer on Gray Davis's gubernatorial campaign. This was 1998, and I tried to talk her out of it. I said, well, volunteers take out the trash and answer the phones, and she did it, and at the end of 2 weeks, I was very nervous. I'm not going to mention names, but there were 2 well-known professional fundraisers who were working for Gray Gray, and she was working for them, and I thought, oh boy, something's going to go wrong, and they'll blame her. Well, what did happen is they asked her to defer her first year of college and stay on the staff for the election. She wasn't old enough to vote for Gray. Right after the election in January, she moved to Sacramento, had her own apartment, and attended staff meetings every morning. So,
wow, growing up fast in politics.
Yeah, so suddenly if Myra and I were at a political event, people would come up to us and they'd say, oh, we know you, you're Marvy's parents.
We got about 10 minutes to go, Irv, and we'd like to sort of segue with this question.
Yeah.
Can you share with our listeners some of the lessons that you've learned through your illustrious career that can be applied to today's increasingly polarized politics?
Yes, it's tragic. There was real bipartisanship. I would sit and have lunch with Republican legislators, and we'd be talking about insurance or horse racing or water, and they would say, you know, I don't know anything about this. So, and they'd mention a Democrat who did, and they'd say, you know, unless this is a party issue, I would vote with them. The polarization that, you know, resulted in term limits, you know, which were horrible because you lost the statesmanship and the institutional memory. So that was sad. And in Washington, it was Pat Buchanan and Newt Gingrich who were just so furious that Clinton had won that started all this evilness, so that you had, 140 Republicans vote to not certify Biden as president. Biden reminds me a lot of Pat Brown, you know, a middle-of-the-road guy who's a really good guy and doing his job, and hopefully he'll get the credit. He certainly was, had a very significant term, you know, in the Congress. People are questioning his capability, but just watch the State of the Union. That was amazing how he handled those Republicans, and the guts to go to Ukraine this week. So I guess you could say he's like Harry Truman. The Republicans hated Truman. They laughed at him. The press made fun of him. We didn't, you know, TV was in its infancy, but people listened to the radio, and the Republican radio commentators made fun of him. And by the 1960 Republican convention, candidates were saying, we need a tough president like Harry Truman. And he was. I mean, he dealt with a lot of crises. And so I hope Biden gets the credit he deserves.
You're right. I mean, he, in his various campaigns for presidency, you didn't really see all of the qualities that we're seeing now. Talk about somebody who's really risen to the job in among the most difficult circumstances any president has had, because not only is your opposition against anything you say, but they are, you know, using all the tools of fascism and racism and everything else to attack him unmercifully.
Yeah, I mean, you know, whoever would have thought that you would have a president that would try to stage a coup, not stand on the steps with the newly elected president and shake his hand, and, you know, no matter what you thought of him.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest with you, in the 50s, my high school teachers were like World War II veterans. You know, they were guys who would have become lawyers or doctors, but, you know, they had to go to work to support their families. But you know, the Holocaust was just 10 or 15 years away, and they'd say, oh, you know, Jews don't have to worry in this country. There's such a unanimous support for freedom and individual rights, and I always believed that. And then 6 months ago, there's so much, not just, anti-Semitism is always there, but, it's on the steps of the House. So I had a formal position in 60 and 61. I was an intern with the Democratic National Committee, and one day somebody walked in with a leaflet and said, this was at my front door, this 1961, and it's signed by Gerald L. T. Smith, who was with Lindbergh and Ford, and Father Coughlin in Detroit was one of the four leaders of the American fascist movement. And there he was in 1961 with an office in Glendale, California, which then was lily white. Today it has more Armenians than any other city in the world, I think, except for the capital of Armenia. So this ugliness comes back. I do have to mention, so in June of 1963, I drove in a presidential motorcade. I may have been the last civilian driver in a presidential motorcade, and we got to the Hilton Hotel, and people were running in. This was a luncheon. They wanted to get there, and the president's just standing about 30 feet away, and I wanted to go over and say hi and remind him how important I was in his career, because I had started students for Kennedy at UCLA, and he just looked like he was preoccupied, and I thought, well, I'll talk to him next time, and of course there was never a next time.
Man.
But, and so we had a common headquarters where the CDC and the National Committee and the County Committee were all on the same floor, and Howard Berman was the intern with the CDC, and we knew each other. We had gone to the same high school, and we knew each other from UCLA, and the three people that were really the UNRWA employees, if they saw me talking to Howard, what were you doing over there? Why are you talking to him? And I had an excuse. You didn't have copiers in, so you had something called Thermofax, where you...
Oh, I remember those, yeah.
Yeah, so I would always say, well, we're the only two that know how to fix the Thermofax machine. But, Woody Allen made and I'm not a big fan of his, a movie about a character named Zelig who shows up at every famous event. And I felt the same way. I've been next to, met with, talked to so many famous people at the Democratic Convention. Eleanor Roosevelt did an impromptu press conference for Stevenson. It was late in the afternoon. All the East Coast reporters were on their way out. And I remember Sandra Van Oker stayed and a couple others. But when it finished, she was just standing there. I started talking to her, and an amazing woman. Stevenson didn't really want to run in 60, but she was running his campaign. And then, of course, Waxman and Berman, they had passes for the Young Democrats, so they literally tried on the day of the floor vote to pack the convention hall, and so if you would have gone by the screaming in the audience, you would have thought Stevenson had a good chance, but Kennedy had already tied it up. But
we're going to have to wrap up in just a moment, but I just want to tell you my start in politics. I was 5 years old, and I lived outside of Chicago in a small suburb, and Adlai Stevenson in '56 came through on the old-fashioned whistle-stop train campaign, and he stopped in our town, and my father put me up on his shoulder so I could see Adlai Stevenson. And from that day, I became a political junkie, somewhat similar to your story of starting at a young age, and Chris also. And for political junkies like us, your stories and your career has been a real inspiration. And we can't thank you enough for sharing
Okay.
with us and for really providing our listeners the best possible start to our new podcast.
So I have to finish with one
Please.
more story. After Kennedy was nominated, the campaign manager decided that Stevenson should appear at the UCLA campus because he was so popular. So his limo dropped him off on the quad, and there was no one there because all the students were on a lawn where he was going to be speaking, like 6,000 people. And I greet him, and I introduce myself, and I said, Governor, we're just going to walk over here. It's about 80 yards. And so halfway through, he says, what's going on here? There's no one here. Are you sure this is correct? And I said, Governor, just wait till you come around the corner. And we came around the corner, and there was just massive cheering, and the man really lit up. So I saw him. But yeah, we all have our stories. Well, thank you. It's been fun for me, and we have to hope that the country can get back to, what everybody intended of fairness and equality, and that we're not going to, as the Congresswoman from wherever she is, Georgia, said, we're not going to divide the country in half.
Yep.
We're
with you 100%.
Thank you, Irv.
both.
Thank you, Irv.
Okay,
And
good night.
you've been our first guest, and we are really honored to have you. And hopefully our listeners feel that your stories were as interesting as we did.
All right, thank you both. Good night.
Good night.
Night. So this has been Captain's Table, and I want to let you know that we're going to be on Facebook if you want to listen to this again or some of our future podcasts. Thank you for listening.